You ready? Great.
And
Oh, this story takes place in the desert. And a lot of the stories of the people of God take place in the desert. So we have to have the desert in our Godly Play classroom. Well, we don't have the whole desert. You can see that we have carpet and stuff like that. But we do have a piece of the desert. It's a big desert. You spread it out. There we go. So, here we go into the story. The desert is a dangerous place. The wind is always blowing, and so the desert is always changing its shape. So it's very easy to get lost, lose your way in the desert. Almost nothing grows in the desert, and there's very little water. And people can die without food and water. In the daytime, it's really hot. But at night, it gets very, very cold. And so you have to wear special clothes when you're in the desert to protect yourself from the heat of the day and the cold of the night. As well, when the wind blows, the sand stings your skin. So those clothes have to protect you from the sand and the wind as well. The desert, well, it's a very dangerous place. People don't go into the desert unless they really have to. After the flood, the creatures of the earth went off in all the directions of the earth to fill it up with life again. And many of the creatures settled near the rivers where they could have water to drink. First, people gathered together in little communities, little villages, and then in towns, and finally in cities. And one of the greatest and most ancient of all the cities was the city of Ur. Now, the people in Ur thought there were many gods. There was a god for each tree, each rock, and each flower. There was a god of the sky, a god of the clouds, a god of the water, and a god of the land. Their world was alive with gods. But there was one family who believed that all of God was everywhere. They didn't know it yet, but that's what they believed. And Abram and Sarai were part of that family. And when it came time to leave the city of Ur, they wondered what it would be like in the new place. They wondered if God would be in that place too. They set off towards Haran with their flocks and their sheep. They even brought all the old people and the children too. During the day, they traveled along the edge of the great river Euphrates that gave them water to drink and showed them the way. At night, they slept in tents under the stars. It was a long, long journey. Finally, they met some people who were coming out of the town of Haran, so they knew they were almost there. And finally, they came to the town of Haran and settled to the west of Haran. Sometimes in the evening, Abram liked to walk out to the edge of the desert and looked out over the sand into the sky. And God came so close to Abram, and Abram came so close to God, that Abram knew what God wanted. God wanted he and Sarai to move on to another new place. So Abram and Sarai did what God asked, and they set out together with all their sheep and their flocks and their helpers. They even took their nephew, Lot, with them, and they headed west towards Canaan. This time, there was no great river to give them water or show them the way. When Abram came to a place called Shechem, he went up the hill and he prayed to God, and he found that God was in that place too. And so he built an altar to show everyone that God was in this place. He and Sarai continued their journey. Till they came to Bethel. And here Abram went and prayed. And he found that God was in this place too. God was not just here or there. All of God was everywhere. So he built an altar at Bethel to show that God was in this place too. But this was not the place that God had chosen for them, and so they continued on until they reached Hebron, and they pitched their tents near the oaks of Mamre. One night, God called Abram out into the edge of the desert. And God came so close to Abram, and Abram came so close to God, that Abram knew what God was saying. God told Abram that he and Sarai would be the mother and father of a great family, as many as the stars in the sky and the grains of sand in the desert. Abram laughed. He and Sarai were too old to have children. God's promise seemed impossible. But he and Sarai did what God asked and changed their names. Abram became Abraham, and Sarai became Sarah. Much time passed, and one day 3 strangers came out of the desert towards Abraham, who was sitting at the front of his tent. Abraham invited them in out of the hot and heat of the day. Sarai prepared 3 measures of flour, which is a lot, and she brought the strangers bread and meat to eat, and milk and water to drink, which was the custom. The 3 strangers told Abraham that he and Sarah would have a son. Abraham laughed. He and Sarah were even older, way too old to have children. And Sarah, who was listening by the edge of the tent, well, she laughed too. Well, the strangers went away back into the desert. And you know what happened? Sarah and Abraham had a son. And they named him Laughter, which in their language is Isaac. The boy Isaac grew to be a young man, and Sarah, old and full of years, died and was buried in a cave under the oak trees of Mamre. Abraham was so sad and desolate. He missed Sarah so much, but he knew there was one more thing he needed to do. He needed to find a wife for his son Isaac from among his people. So he took his most trusted advisor, Eleazar, and he sent him back to Haran to find a wife for Isaac. And as Eleazar rested beside a well, Rebekah came out and drew water from the well for him to drink, and she also drew water to feed and water his flocks. Rebekah was as full of courage as she was kind, and she invited him back to her home to meet her father. That night, the trusted servant told Rebekah and her family about Isaac, about Abraham and Sarah, and the promise of the great family. And Rebekah was very excited, and she wanted to be part of that great family. So Rebekah left her family, went into the desert, past Shechem, past Bethel, and as she was coming in a far distance, Isaac saw her and ran out to meet her. And Isaac and Rebekah were married. By this time, Abraham was old and full of years, and he died. And he was buried in the cave beside Sarah under the oaks of Mamre. Well, Rebekah and Isaac had children, and their children had children, and their children had children, and it went on like that for thousands of years until your grandparents had children, and then your parents had children, and now here you are, part of the great family, as many as the stars in the sky and the grains of sand in the desert. So I wonder what part of this story you like the best. Maybe I wonder. What's part of the story you think is the most important? Wondering if it might be this part or this part or this part. Wonder. Maybe this part. I wonder where you are in the story. I wonder what part of the story is about you. I wonder. I wonder if there's anything we can take away from the story and still have all the story that we need. How about this? Can we take away this? Haran? How about Shechem? Can we take that away? I wonder what you're thinking. I'm wondering what if we took away the Euphrates River. Would we still have all the story we needed? I wonder what you're thinking about that. Oh, Isaac? I wonder. And I wonder if there's anyone in your family who's part of this story, this great family. Anyone in your family who's taken a long trip to a new country because God's calling them, or maybe to a new job because God's calling them. I'm wondering if there are people in your family who've trusted in the promise of God, like Abraham and Sarah did. I wonder. Well, thank you for being with us. I'm going to put the story away now. Here's the river Euphrates. If you look on a map, you'll see this river today, and the Tigris. Here's the city of Haran and the great city of Ur. It's an ancient city. There's another city that's there in this day. You might check that out in an atlas. Here's Shechem, the altar at Bethel. Where all of God was in every place. Here are the part of the people of God. And here's the beginning of the great family. Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, and Rebecca. And here's the desert. We're going to come back to this desert because lots of the stories of the people of God happen in the desert. Thanks for coming. I'm going to give you a blessing. And this is the blessing that God gave Aaron, Moses' brother. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace.